Well, it is 7 p.m., and so it is time for us to get started tonight. And let me first of all say welcome to everyone who is registered and is joining us tonight. Welcome to the 2020 edition of Voices of the Wilderness. It is what we're calling the at-home edition of Voices of the Wilderness. Obviously, very mindful of the pandemic that has impacted all of our lives across the country and has led to having to make changes. And while we're certainly sorry that we can't gather in person with our community, we certainly thought it was appropriate to move this event online. And one of the great benefits to moving Voices of the Wilderness online is that it allows us to have more of our community join us from all across the state of Montana and all across the country, quite frankly. So thank you all for signing up to join us tonight. Talk for a minute about the Voices of the Wilderness event. This is a big annual fundraiser for us, but also a big opportunity for us to educate people about our work, about the activities in and around the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. And I'm excited to have you with us. My name is Bill Hodge. I'm the executive director of the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, and that is a great honor for me to be able to serve in that role and work on the team that I get to work with every day. Voices of the Wilderness is a series of events. This is our first of 3 fireside chats. Tonight we will be focused on author John Fraley and his new book, Heroes of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. A week from tonight, we will be having a fireside chat about Bears of the Bob. We'll be joined by Tim Manley from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and Bryce Andrews, an author of an incredible book called Down from the Mountain, and also with the organization People and Carnivores. And then 2 weeks from tonight on the 29th, we'll be celebrating 80 years of the Bob Marshall Wilderness, and we'll be joined by a bevy of guests that night to talk about that 80-year history and the history that even precedes the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. A lot of other things going on with Voices of the Wilderness. Today we launched our online auction, and a huge thanks to the incredible artists, craftsmen, and women, the gear manufacturers, the incredible destinations that have provided the over 40 items that are in the auction this year. You can find the auction by going to our website, which is BMWF, as in Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation.org. There is a banner across the top of our website. You click there and it'll take you into all the offerings in the Voices of the Wilderness event. There'll be a chance for you to register for the next 2 fireside chats, a way for you to click through and find the amazing items that are up for bid in that auction, and also a chance for you to buy raffle tickets. We're selling 400 raffle tickets for a chance at a number of prizes, the granddaddy of which is a beautiful new Kokopelli pack raft, and we will be drawing for that on October 30th, and buying tickets for that will end on the 29th. The auction will also end at 9:30 Mountain Time on the 29th as well, this night of our last fireside chat. So thanks to those of you who have already gotten involved. We're off to a roaring start with the auction. Before we launched this, we were already well over 40% towards our goal, and that's a few hours into a 2-week live auction. So your support and our community support is incredibly important to the foundation to support our work in the Bob. Without our donors, without our corporate sponsors, and most importantly, without our incredible volunteers, we wouldn't be able to accomplish the incredible trail projects, weed mitigation projects, and education efforts that we engage in at the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. So thanks to your support throughout the years as volunteers, donors, and corporate sponsors. Make sure you support those corporate donors that support our work, and you can find that on the Voices of the Wilderness webpage as well as our regular homepage. 2020 has been a unique year for us, to say the least. Our work was modified a few different times. We ended up having to curtail our volunteer opportunities first by limiting it to folks from Montana to try to decrease the chance of any spread of the virus in the state of Montana. We had to modify the projects based on where the Forest Service wanted us to work this year. And ultimately, the virus led to us having to pare down to just working with our staff in the latter half of the summer. But we were able to still get a lot of important work done on the trail, a lot of important weeds work done. And we could only do that work because of support of amazing folks like yourselves. I'd like to say a special thank you to the staff here, the incredible team that I get to work with, Rebecca, Allison, Meg, Sue, I'd like to thank our board of directors who volunteer and put in a tireless effort to make this organization go. I mentioned that 2020 is the 80th anniversary of the Bob. It's also next year, 2021, is going to be the 25th anniversary of the foundation. What an achievement. And earlier this year, the Forest Service at the Washington office recognized that legacy of almost a quarter century of work from the foundation, thousands and thousands of volunteers, tens and hundreds of thousands of hours put into the Bob. So thank you to everybody who makes that possible. You know, when we talk about the Bob, we have, of course, talking about the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, the Bob Marshall Wilderness, Scapegoat Wilderness, and the Great Bear Wilderness. But we think it's important to acknowledge before we put that title on it, this was home. This was home to the Salish, Kootenai, and Blackfeet people. It's something we should address every time we talk about our public lands and talk about this special place that we get to work. So I just want to acknowledge that. You'll find us constantly acknowledging that because it's an important part of the history of the land here in Northwest Montana, and frankly, the entire National Wilderness Preservation System as well. All right, so that's enough from me. But again, thank you all for joining us. That brings us to tonight. And our special guest to start us off is going to be the author of a number of incredible books like A Woman's Way West, which I just recently enjoyed reading, Wild River Pioneers, Rangers, Trappers, and Trailblazers. And of course, the newest one, the one we're here to talk about, is Heroes of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. And we're not only going to be talking to John Fraley, the author of this book, but also some of the heroes that are profiled in that book. So with that, I am going to unmute John. Here we go. John, welcome to Voices of the Wilderness and tonight's Fireside Chat.
Thanks a lot, Bill, and thanks for being willing to work with me on this book. You did a terrific job. You even wrote the foreword to it.
Well, thanks for the honor of writing it for it. It was one, it gave me a special preview of the book before it came out, but as you found out very early on, John, you were one of the very first people to welcome me to the foundation when I got started in my role here, and to a year later have you approached me about writing it. It is quite an honor, so thank you. I first want to ask you before we talk specifically about Heroes of the Bob is what brought you to the craft of writing these incredible books that are obviously all pretty much set here in this incredible landscape we get to live? What brought you to it?
Well, very simply, I was working for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks up here in the Flathead for 38 years, and one of my main areas I worked was the Bob Marshall Great Bear, especially the Great Bear. I just fell in love with the wilderness. I always have. I've got almost a half a century myself in the wilderness, and so it's just been a privilege to try to keep alive all these stories of not only the old timers that have passed, but the middle timers and the new timers as well. So it's been great fun, and we've got Smoke Elser and Bill Workman here, who are two of the best packers of their generation. It's an honor to be around them. They're heroes of the Bob.
So why Heroes of the Bob? What led to this book specifically?
Well, I think that all of us that have been in the Bob Marshall and in other wilderness areas, and I'm hoping to talk about this at the end too, we have a feeling of spiritualism about the Bob. And I've noticed that from everybody, all 14 heroes that I interviewed and the ones that are past now. And so I wanted to try to make that point. I wanted to try to kind of grasp that and see how each individual, who I call heroes, because they're out there. Bill has spent, 1,500 nights in backcountry cabins and packed 41,000 miles, and Smoke, who knows how long, since the 50s, how many he's done. And it's not easy. You kind of eschew the comforts of home, and you're out there keeping the wilderness open for all of us, whether you're maintaining trails, whether you're introducing people to the wonders of the wilderness so that they advocate for wilderness themselves.
Early in the book, you actually profile Bob himself, which is, he's such an interesting character. I've been an avid Bob fan long before I got to the foundation. And, what are your takeaways from the research you did in looking into Bob Marshall, the person? Because one thing I've learned since getting to Montana is if I tell people that I work for the foundation, the first words I'm going to hear are going to be, "Oh, I love the Bob." And very rarely do I get to go and have a conversation and saying, "Well, do you know who Bob Marshall himself was?" But what did you find interesting in looking at Bob and some of the stories that you heard about Bob and that you've profiled in the book?
Well, you've made a great point in saying that Bob Marshall might be one of the most influential people that's not generally famous in the United States for what he's done. And that's because wilderness is, he wrote, his first paper was called Wilderness as a Minority Right, where he argued for the right of people who want to spend time in the wilderness to be able to do that, even though it didn't fit Gifford Pinchot's idea of the most for the best, for the, the utilizing in conservation. He felt it was, people should have the opportunity to experience wilderness. And he was a wilderness evangelist, is what I call him, because he was always promoting wilderness. And we got a second right here, so I want to do a little Bob Marshall reading examples. Arctic Village is a super book he wrote that gives a lot of his opinions in there, and then the forward talks a lot about his life. And then Best of All, Alaska Wilderness is another great book to think about, to read, that Bob wrote. So you want to read Alaska Wilderness and Arctic Village, and you also want to read his bookend papers, Wilderness as a Minority Right from 1928, and The Problem with the Wilderness in Scientific American in 1930. So those are kind of his bookends where he puts out that philosophy of wilderness, and he talks about forming the Wilderness Society in the latter paper. And I'll mention a little bit about when he dashed through the Bob in 1928. I want to talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, Bob not only had this philosophy about wilderness, he put some might behind it. He put some teeth behind it. When they say he funded the startup of the Wilderness Society, I mean, he funded it. He paid Robert Sterling Yard's salary as the original secretary of the Wilderness Society, for years. And Bob's estate went on to pay that after Bob died at such a young age, at 38 years old, went on to pay, Robert Sterling Yards and future salaries to get the Wilderness Society, and therefore ultimately the Wilderness Act itself passed in 1964. But yeah, tell us a little bit about that, John. We're, on the 29th, we're going to have Chris Peterson join us, and he's going to actually talk about him retracing that famous hike. But it was a pretty big dash through the wilds, wasn't it?
It really was, and it's really interesting. People just think, and I'm really looking forward to getting to Bill and Smoker, and we will real soon. But people think that Bob just showed up and walked through the wilderness. He was a Forest Service employee. He had a master's degree in forestry from Harvard, and he had this all planned. He was going to go through the Bob so he could experience and learn from the people administering this. It wasn't even the primitive areas yet. And so he went through as a learning experience, and he went through to try to convince everybody that we need actual designated wilderness. That's why I call him a wilderness evangelist. And so when he went through there in 1928, he went for 5 days and 182 miles and 39,000 feet in elevation altogether, wrote everything down. I don't know how he had time to do all this, talked to all the different forest rangers, and probably met Joe Murphy. Now, Joe Murphy was the outfitter at Murphy Flat. And Bill, you remember you got that one old coffee pot you found from Murphy's camp there. Bill was the big outfitter of the early west side of the Bob, and he convinced thousands of people about the value of wilderness in his own way. He went with the folks called the American Forestry Association Wilderness Riders of the Wilderness, and there were actors, CEOs, school teachers, government employees, best friend of Bob Marshall. You could go on forever. They all paid a certain amount of money, and then Joe Murphy took them through the Bob in a long trip. And when they got out, they were so excited about wilderness, they couldn't wait to get there and advocate for it. So Bob and Joe kind of came together in 1928, and they were both doing their own kind of evangelism. And that to me is just very neat. You got the academic and you've got the cowboy. And when Bob came out the other end and went down and out at Holland Lake, went on to get his PhD at Johns Hopkins, he the very next year he was exploring Alaska, and he named Gates of the Arctic National Park and Reserve. And remember, he did the Bob and did the Gates of the Arctic, naming Gates of the Arctic, writing all this stuff about wilderness that's now just taken verbatim. He put all the philosophy out there. He was 27 when he went through the Bob, and he was 28 when he named Gates of the Arctic. So imagine yourself at 27 or 28 setting the leading national policy. So that's why he's so important to me, and I wanted to focus on it. And my oldest son, Kevin, I named him Kevin Marshall Fraley. And he lives up in Alaska and has retraced some of Bob's big long trips up there in the North Fork of the Koyukuk out of Wiseman. So that brings us through the Murphy chapter. Just let me backtrack just a little bit. I'd just like to acknowledge everyone that's helped on this book, because it's been the Murphys themselves, Dennis and Janie, Janie, who is in a living area here. She actually is Joe's daughter, and she's still sharp. And though they really helped me piece together Joe's story, and it's about a 40-page part of the book and lots of great photos on it. So I really acknowledge them and all the folks that have helped put this together. So that's the thing about Bob.
You know, he was a heck of an individual. You held up the book, Village. Bob shared the proceeds from that book with every resident of that village. It's the kind of guy he was, you know, and beyond his impact for wilderness, you know, thinking about what we're going through in 2020, he was a guy who advocated for the integration of Forest Service campgrounds in the 1930s in some of the original Forest Service recreation policies. He was a guy that looked to root out religious discrimination within people who had special use permits on forests. So yeah, he was quite the character. I'm gonna Smoke, I lied to you. I'm gonna hit ask you to unmute, and you'll have to actually unmute yourself, Smoke, so we can bring you into the conversation. I think Bill, I've already got you unmuted, but no, we'll get you added here in a second, Smoke. Sorry, I thought we were able to unmute you from this end, but it should. We're gonna get Smoke's technical support in here to help unmute his microphone real quick. But
well,
John, let's talk about the chance that Bob and Joe potentially met each other, but we'll never know.
No, we'll never know. But it's, you know, on August 31st, 1928, Bob Marshall walked right through Murphy Flat, and if Joe was there, they definitely met. And then he went on to Big Prairie and spent a couple of days with Henry Thole, who was administering Joe's special permit on that lodge. Bob couldn't have missed the lodge that was there. It's this big lodge and corrals in the middle of the wilderness. So I'm sure they talked about it. I'm sure they, and so just to go back a little, so that's the way the book, the first few chapters of the book, and then it goes on to all these different heroes, including these two fellows right here. And we'll get to a couple of those a little later, but yeah, let's bring these guys in.
Yeah, so why don't you introduce Bill for us, John? And there are some incredible stories from Bill's thousands and thousands of hours in the saddle. So why don't you take over, Bill, and let's hear from Bill.
Bill is one of the greatest these two are the greatest storytellers I've ever experienced. And I spent a lot of time with these two. And Bill is just, his stories are so funny as well. And he, for example, if you can believe this, you know, 42,000 miles or so in the Bob packing, 20 or 25,000 mule loads packing, well over 1,000 nights at different backcountry cabins. So he's really experienced the wilderness in an amazing way. And some of the really terrific stories that he's told, he is going to share with us a little bit tonight. So should we ask Bill to talk about the moose lassoing story first? Go for it, Bill.
It's a good one. And Bill, before you get started, Smoke, I think I've got a simple instruction that actually one of our participants has shared, which you can unmute yourself literally by just hitting the space bar on your computer, and that should unmute you. And I'll let you know if you're successful.
Go for it, Bill.
Well, like I was telling you boys, I didn't really think it was all that exciting. For all the viewers, I don't want them to think that that I chased a moose through the woods on my horse and I was swinging that rope, screaming down the mountain, crossing rivers, right behind some 50-inch moose or nothing like that. So really how it, I guess, yeah, hell, I was laying on the bed there at Black Bear when some crews come in and they said they saw a moose down in the river bottom there below the cabin. And I didn't even get up and go look. I've never seen a moose at Black Bear before, but I have quite a few moose,
You
so
can go.
I thought that was kind of cool. Didn't think
Yeah.
no more about it. And I guess the next morning, me and Nick Stokes leaving out of there. And when we crossed the river on the bridge, I did see that moose was still below the cabin. And so we got across the bridge. I told Nick, let's go over to the edge of the bank and look over there at him, which we did. And from that distance, we couldn't see what was wrong with him or anything, but I did think he looked a little bit like an old thick calf or something like that. And I said to Nick, well, yeah, he must be sick, still there all night, and the ears are drooping a little bit. Had no idea about him being in any wire, never gave it a thought. So anyways, we left. We were both heading out. I had come down from Big Prairie the night before, and Nick had come in from Spotted Bear. So we climbed up on the hill and got up on the flat. About the time we heard one of the crews that was still at Black Bear radio in that actually that moose was caught in the old phone line. And what should they do? And so our ranger got on and said, well, see if you can turn it loose and keep me posted. So we heard that, and I radioed back to the station and said that, well, me and Nick would go back and see if we could help out too. So we tied the mules up there up on top and ran back down to the cabin there. And one crew had left, but the river crew was still there. A guy and a gal. And so me and Nick, and we walked over to the bank to look at this moose. On the ride back there, I was trying to think of how the heck a guy could get close enough to a moose to get him out of the wire, and thought maybe we could, snub him up to a tree or something. Well, we get there and look over the bank, and of course he's on the edge of the river. There's no trees around, no nothing. And with us looking at him, he actually wandered out into the water a little ways. It wasn't like he was caught in the middle of some phone line and couldn't go anywhere. He was hooked to phone line, but he could run however far he wanted to till he snagged up that line again, of course. And I called Deb Mucklow, was the ranger then, because it didn't look really good about getting him loose. And I said, well, do you think you could call the Fish and Game and see if they might want to come in and dart him or something and get him turned loose? And she said, well, she called and let us know in a couple minutes. She called back and said, no, they won't come in and do anything to the moose. She said, you guys try to do something, and if you can, good. If not, she said, you got permission actually to put him down if it looks like you can't turn him loose, because otherwise you're going to sit there and die anyway. So, well, nobody really wanted to do that, and I figured we'd think of something. So there was a downed tree that had floated down a river and kind of lodged up on another piece of a log. It had some roots on the end of it. It was a whole tree, probably 8 to 9 inches around, DBH. Anyways, well, maybe we could get him snubbed to that dang thing somehow. And I guess we looked the situation over. Because we were looking at the moose, he ran back out in the river a little ways. And I thought if I could get him up by that root wad, maybe we could somehow snatch him up to that and turn him loose. So I didn't know how to get him back to the root wad, except I got to thinking maybe Alicia could take her little boat and float down a river. So I was scared about telling her to do this by herself, because the moose could actually still run quite a ways. And I didn't really want her to get ate out in the middle of the river. So I said, well, we'll both go down there. I don't know what good that would have done, but I also thought, well, that might slow the boat down with two of us in her little teeny boat. And I finally decided maybe she better do it by herself. And I actually said my excuse at that time was I told her I would go with her, but I was afraid that my spurs would poke a hole in her boat. So she, really, it's because I can't swim. So anyway, she does. She floats down past the moose, and he didn't do a thing. So she got off on the other side of the bank, went back up the river, and I hollered at her, well, if she was brave enough to go ahead and get a little closer to him. And so she tried it again and a little closer to the moose, and he did. He come back out of the water into the rocks kind of by that tree there. So I thought, well, if he would stay there, maybe I could sneak up there and throw a rope on him. Found an old rope, wasn't old, brand spanking new, but it wasn't really a lariat type rope, but it's what I found anyhow, really long. I told Alicia then to just park down below the moose a little bit on the edge of the river and beat on the water with her oars, anything to keep him distracted. And I would try to sneak down there and see if I could get close enough to rope it. And I had Nick and Ben, the other river ranger person, I had them had a hold of the number 9 wire that went down over the hill to the moose, and told them that if that moose did anything, to run with all the wire they could and wrap it on something to shorten up how far that moose could run, so possibly he wouldn't eat me then. So that's what they were doing. They were up on the bank. Alicia was in the river with her boat, and I went down over the hill quite a ways away from that tree and then started sneaking up to the moose. And of course, every time he would look at me, I would stop, and Alicia would get his attention again, and I would sneak a little further until I finally actually did. I got to the end of the tree there, and then I could kind of use the roots that stuck up a little bit as a little bit of cover too, but I was still afraid he was going to come running around them roots and eat me at some point. And probably about in there, when I started getting a little closer, is when I started thinking about the picture that hangs on the wall of all the ranger stations in the country of a guy getting ate by a moose over at Schaefer. That's all I could think about. But anyhow, it worked. I got closer and closer and closer, and pretty soon I got to where the wire ran out across that log. It went out into the riverways and then back to that moose. There's a bunch of slack in it because he could go a little ways. He just couldn't go past however far the end of that wire was. But when I could have cut him loose there too, but I figured he'd be dragging a couple 100 feet of number 9 wire still, so we thought we'd try to do better than that. So actually, I just kept sneaking until I was pretty close to the end of that log, and I had to get up on the log to rope him. And I have to tell you guys, I always wanted to be a cowboy, of course, but I never was a very dang good roper. I rope a lot better when there's nobody around to see it. Every once in a while, through the years, I have caught some. And most of the time I caught something, then I wished that I didn't. I got up enough nerve to stand up on that log and throwed my loop, and I wanted to catch both horns. He wasn't a huge moose, but anyhow, me being the way I rope, I only caught one horn. I didn't know any way to get the rope off and try it again, so I thought, well, one horn probably hold him if it does. So I actually just took a wrap around the log about where I was standing, probably 20 feet from the root wad, and the moose is on the other side of the root wad. And the rope was so dang long, It's a big old cotton rope, brand new, not the best lariat, but I cut it and I built another loop and I roped his other horn. And my thought was to get him close enough to them roots that a guy could, sneak up there and cut that wire. I did get him caught again. I took a wrap on that log, but I couldn't get him close enough to the roots to reach him. So I called Nick to come down off the bank and help me see if we could get him closer to the tree. So Nick comes down there and he's easing down there and he gets pretty close. I can tell he's a little nervous. And he said, man, the only thing I can think of is that picture that hangs on the wall of all them places of that guy getting ate by the moose. I laughed. I told him that's what I thought too. And so he laughed. Pretty sure the other guys thought we were pretty crazy. But anyhow, between the two of us, we actually were able to wiggle him up so his head was not too far the other side of the roots on that tree, and tied him off good. And then basically I just, I crawled up the log and I cut the wire. He had one piece under his chin and of course around his horns. And I cut the one under his chin and I cut the wire that was holding him. Now he still had a bunch of wire around the base of the horns and stuff, but that wasn't going to bother him, we didn't think. So he's free of the wire, and now he's only tied by a couple of ropes, of course. I'm still scared he's going to come running around that log and eat. I told Nick to untie one of them ropes and go back over to the bank, and if it was long enough to dally around the tree, which he did. And so after he got over there and got the thing dallied out, I cut both ropes actually as quick as I could and then ran back to Nick. My thought being, though, when I cut the first one, if he wanted to come after me or whatever, Nick could slow him up a little bit with the one still on him. But as it turned out, I cut both ropes, not very close to the moose, probably 3 feet away from him. And so then he was loose. I ran over to the bank. Well, the poor old moose, he didn't know he was loose, so he didn't do a thing. I thought he was going to, he acted kind of mad when we were snugging him up there. And he'd either been there so long or mad or whatever. He was huffing and bloodshot eyes. And when he'd wiggle around, he'd wiggle that log that we were standing on. So I thought he was a little mad. Well, when I cut the ropes, he didn't know he was even loose. So he just stood there. I actually went back down the bank, picked up a couple rocks, threw them at his butt, and he ran off across the river. So we were all pretty dang tickled. And I guess we radioed into the ranger that we got it done, and she was pretty tickled about that. And she also let the Fish and Game know that we had gotten it done. And then it wasn't very long. She forwarded me the coolest email from somebody named John Fraley. Said that, well, I knew if anybody could do it, Bill Workman could.
I remember writing that email.
So that was all well and good. I get out to the station and everybody out there knows about it because of the radio conversation and what. Gail, my wife, was not back to work quite yet. Told her on the phone all about it, of course. She said, man, I can't wait to see pictures. I said, well, there's 4 of us there. Not one of us took a single damn picture. So we don't have no pictures to prove it, but there is 3 or 4 people live that saw that. And then about a week later, Gail comes back to work, and we're up at Meadow Creek. I'm loading my mules. She's standing on the back of the flatbed handing me packs, and the mule I got tied to the flatbed, he starts trying to look around behind him. And I just thought the way he's acting, there might be a little bear or something wandering by. But, we turn around and look also. And I could barely make out. I said, well, oh, it ain't a bear, it's a moose. And Gail, she's up on the truck there. She looks at her, she says, well, yeah, it's your moose too. And sure as hell, that moose goes walking up to Meadow Creek Road right by the sign to go into the outfitter's roost there, and she's got or the packer's roost where we take off. And it's not a good picture, but she actually got a picture of that moose with them old white ropes dangling off his horns, walking up that road.
What
That
a-
almost seems impossible to believe, you know?
I just have to say, who thought there'd be a day that we'd be talking about a moose lasso on something called Zoom? So, fun night.
That's great, Bill. Well, hey, Bill, why don't we get Smoke to tell us one of his favorite stories out of there? That was, unless you want to grab a question, if you have any right now first, and then we could.
I will say I will tell people there is a Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. If you've got questions you'd like us to ask John or Smoke or Bill, put it in there. I also will check the chat box from time to time, but the Q&A box would be a great place for folks if they have questions. But John, yeah, please, let's get Smoke in here.
All right. Smoke, you want to tell us one of your favorite stories out of the book, or it doesn't have to be out of the book also, but I can cue you if you want me to, but I'm sure you have a favorite one or two. Your chapter is really long, got a lot of awesome stories in it.
Well, I don't really have any favorite stories other than the whole Bob Marshall. The only thing I'd like to say is, I've seen that picture at Schaefer several times with the guy roping the moose in the corral. That's around in that part of the country a lot. Well, I don't know. I've had a lot of different experiences in the backcountry with guests. I had one particular guest. He arrived in Missoula via air. He came in with a bunch of hunters, and I had 4 hunters, and we packed them up and took them up to the Bob Marshall, except for one. One hunter missed his flight out of Denver, and it wasn't there. So the next day I had to go down and pick him up at Missoula Airport. So I pack up in the morning, and I take a mule and head down the trail and get down to the airport. And I'm standing there waiting. The plane arrives, and I see a lot of people getting off. I wonder, how in the heck am I going to identify this hunter? Well, it wasn't too hard. He was wearing an orange jacket. So I figured that must be my hunter. So I go over and I introduce myself, and I said, "Where's your gear? Let's get going. I want to get into camp before dark." He said, "Okay, here's my gear." And he had 2 duffel bags, of course, big ones. All hunters bring big bags full of all kinds of stuff they never use. But anyway, we packed up, and I threw that in the car, and up the road we went. Got to Montour Creek, brought in the mule, saddled him up, and managed up his 2 big duffel bags, one on each side. Was plenty of load for that mule, and we started up the trail. And I showed him some of the country as we were passing through it, the falls on Falls Creek and some of that thing. And finally, we got up to camp just at about dark, and the other hunters were just getting in after their first day of hunting. And of course, they all meet each other and shake each other's hands, and they all have a drink, right away. And the hunter puts his gear in the tent, and I say, "Well, that's your cot over there." So he goes over there and puts his gear there, and just then a light bulb came on in my head. Where in the heck's his rifle? I didn't see any rifle. I said, "Where's your rifle?" He said, "Well, I've got it. And he undid one of his duffel bags and pulled out a cardboard box about 30 inches, 35 inches long, and about 6 inches, 7 inches wide. And it was still taped up and had shipping tags on it. And we cut the tags and opened it up, and here's his rifle, all in pieces, the bolt in one little part of the box, and the stock and the barrel. Anyway, here we are. We've got a rifle that isn't even put together yet. Obviously, the hunter had never shot it. He's never shot at an elk or a deer or anything with it. So I said, "Well, we don't know what to do. We're going to have to try to put it together." So we started in with a couple of Leatherman and a couple of screwdrivers and a pair of pliers that we had there in camp. And we started to put it together. And we finally got the rifle pretty well together. And I said, "Well, you don't have any scope, or how are we going to?" "Well, I've got a scope." He went in his other duffel bag and pulled out a box with a scope in it. And of course, it had never been mounted on that rifle at all. So here we are again, trying to mount that scope on that rifle. Anyway, we get it pretty well mounted. By then it's about 11:30, 12 o'clock. And of course, we're getting sleepy because we want to get up early and get out hunting at about 4:30, 5 o'clock. So that we can ride to the area where we're going to hunt. Anyway, we finally get the scope on, and we bore sighted it, by using a spoon and a flashlight. You can shine a light through the barrel, and you can roughly get a bore sight that way. Not very accurate, but at least it's going to hit the mountain away from you. So anyway, he goes in and he says, "Okay, that's good." He said, "Now I'm all set." So went to hit the sack, got up early. I got up and built fire, got breakfast on, and asked everybody to come on in here. Let's see. Got all the hunters in there, and they were all sitting down. Finally, he come in. He was dressed in orange from head to toe. I mean, I think he had orange underwear. Anyway, he was all in orange. We talked about it a bit, and I said, "Okay, be careful, because nobody's going to shoot you, but the elk they're going to obviously be able to see you too, anywhere." So we got breakfast all ready and finished, and the guys were saddling up the horses and getting ready to pull out. And I said, "Well, where's your ammunition?" He said, "I've got it." He brought in 4 boxes of ammunition. And I thought, geez, man, he had 270, 30-06, 300, and a 270 bullets. He says, "Which one of these bullets does my rifle use?" He didn't even have a clue. So finally fitted up his 30-06 with a 30-06 shell. And I said, "You carry 4 of these, 2 in each pocket." And I said, "Try to wrap a handkerchief around one of them at least so they don't rattle." He said, "Okay." So we go out and get out, and we hunted that whole hunt with the orange hunter, which everybody knew where he was, because all you had to do is glance across the hillside and you could see this orange guy walking along hunting. He did get a shot. I don't know where the shot hit at all, because he might have hit the other side of the mountain. But at any rate, he was just tickled to death to have the hunt. And those are some of the hunters that you get. You advertise a little bit and get a few hunters in, and pretty soon you get a guy that doesn't know a thing about hunting and has never hunted before. He just wanted to have the experience. So we gave him that experience, and I'll never forget the orange hunter that didn't have a rifle that was put together and no sights on it or anything else. So that's kind of one of the stories that I've had.
Hey, I have a question for you, Smoke. Is it true that you made it possible for people inside the Bob to actually watch the moon landing? Is that a true story?
That's true. Yep, that's true. Yeah, in July 1969, I met a group at the motel. I had a party of 7. There was a family, a husband and wife, and 3 kids, and another couple. They were going in the hills in the summer and going fishing. So anyway, I picked them up at the hotel, and we drove to the end to Montour again, or to the North Fork this time. We were going up over Whiskey Ridge. But at any rate, we got up to the North Fork and started to load. We managed up all their gear, and they had 2 big foot lockers, regular military foot lockers. They were all locked down and everything. And so I said, "What do you want to do with these?" He said, "Well, we've got to have them." So we managed them up, and of course that was a whole mule load. Geez, they were heavy. We picked them up, and they were probably 70, 80 pounds each. Good and heavy enough. By the time we got the manties on them, they were probably 90 pounds. So at any rate, we packed them up and started up the trail, and went by the North Fork, went over the North Fork Bridge and by the North Fork cabin, and on up to the base of Whiskey Ridge, and we camped right there at Cabin Creek. Spent the night. And of course, we unmanned everything and unmanned those 2 boxes. And they never opened them. They just left them sit right out there in the little meadow. So next morning, we packed up again, manned those 2 boxes up, and loaded them on the mule again. Geez, that mule didn't like it too well because they were pretty heavy. Anyway, we started up the trail. This was the 15th, and this was the 16th now of July. And when we started up the trail and got into the Danaher, and we went down to Spring Creek, where I always like to camp. And there we unloaded and set up everything and unmanned those boxes, and there they sat. Nobody touched them. I finally stacked them up against a tree so that I thought, well, they're going to get into them one of these days. I thought there was all their fishing gear, but it really wasn't. They had all their fishing gear because they fished in the Danaher at that time and did a lot of fishing up and down the Danaher. Well, we stayed there a day, and we stayed there the 16th or the 17th and 18th. And on the 19th, I decided, well, we better move on down to Basin Creek. So again, we mannied up everything and mannied up them 2 darn boxes. And they were heavier than heck. We loaded them, mannied them up, loaded them on this old mule, and the mule groaned a little bit this time. He says, what the heck's going on here? You haven't used anything out of this box. So anyway, we traveled on down to Basin Creek, and I camped right there on Camp Creek, just above the trail there a little ways. Again, we unmanned everything, unmanned the boxes, and there they sat. Well, this was the 19th. The people all went out fishing. And I thought, well, they'll get into those boxes now. Heck, we're into this trip a few days now. They'll need something out of there. They never touched them. That night, the 19th, why the father, he come over to me and he says, Smoke, he said, where's the highest point we can get from this camp to where we can have a moonlight ride? I said, what do you mean a moonlight ride? He said, well, I checked it and we're going to have a full moon. And he said, I want my kids to be able to ride up some high mountain and then ride down in the moonlight. And I said, okay, well, we'll try. And I said, oh, well, heck, look right across the valley there. There's Jumbo Mountain. We'll go to the top of Jumbo. There's a trail up there and it starts off right here. So he said, by the way, he said, I'd like to go, we can leave maybe 2, 3 o'clock and get up there. And then that way we can have a little campfire. And then when the moon comes up, we'll see the moon coming up. We can drop down and hit the trail and come out. I said, okay. He said, I want those 2 boxes to go with us. I looked at him and I said, what the heck for? And he says, I just want those 2 boxes. Don't worry about it. So anyway, next morning they went out fishing for a little while and came in at about 2 o'clock. We ate a kind of a supper dinner type thing and finished up, saddled up the horses and packed up them 2 darn boxes again, loaded them on a poor mule, and up the trail we went. We switched back all the way to the top of Jumbo, and at that time, Jumbo was not manned. He was unmanned at that time. There was a period of time there in the 60s and 70s where the lookout was not manned. The only thing they had there, by the way, was solar panels on the roof to keep a repeater radio going in the lookout. But at any rate, that's why the trail was opened all the time. The Forest Service opened that trail up so they could go up and maintain the repeater radio. Anyway, we got up there and tied up the horses, and my crew went out and gathered up some firewood there, and we built a little campfire there, and the kids were all tickled, and they were looking out over the area and going out on the catwalk around the lookout, and everything was going good, except here's the old man come over, where's my boxes? So I managed the boxes, and he opened them up, and the one had a lot of aluminum tubes like tent poles, and they all fastened together. They slipped together like a regular tent pole, and he had a whole roll or 2 of wire, coils of wire. So anyway, he hooks them all together and hooks these aluminum poles together and wires them all together here and there, and throws that wire up over a couple of the trees. Of course, the trees there were more than, they were only 20, 30 feet high at the most. And he threw a couple of 1 wire over the top of the lookout and let it drop down on the other side, on the Youngs Creek side, with a rock. And anyway, he got all that stuff done. I thought, what the heck are you doing? And he said, well, you watch. And anyway, he opened up the next box, and there he had 6 6-volt fence wire batteries hooked in series. So he had power. And inside there was a little TV set with a screen a lot smaller than the computer screens we're looking at right now. It was only about 8 by 10 inches, but it was a battery operated TV set. Anyway, he said, I'm going to see if I can get any stations. And I said, you won't get there. We're way back in here. You aren't going to get any stations. Anyway, he fiddled around with that for a while, the snow come on and all that kind of stuff. And it got pretty bad. and it made a lot of noise, you know. And the kids, we got them out some marshmallows and Hershey bars and had s'mores over there, and the kids were having a good time. And by golly, everything went along pretty good. And this thing, he was still over there fiddling with this and moving the wires and moving the aluminum poles around here and there. Finally, by golly, at about 8:30, we heard a hissing sound, and it stopped. And a guy came on the TV. Kind of, at first it was pretty fuzzy, you know, and just you could hardly see it. But pretty soon we could see a guy, and he was holding a pair of glasses in his hand like this. And he said, "One step for man, one giant step for mankind." And we watched him land on the moon on top of Jumbo Mountain in 1969. So, and of course we saw the moon come up, and all the guys got out their field glasses, you know. Oh, I can see them. They're over there on the right side of the moon. See them? Oh, yeah, they're right there. No, couldn't see anything. But at any rate, he wanted to have his kids enjoy that on top of Jumbo Mountain. You know, I heard from the man about, it's been about 10 years ago now. The son, he sent us a letter card. He said, yeah, he remembers that trip yet. He said, every time they send a spaceship into the outer space, he said, I remember that trip up to Jumbo.
Awesome.
What a great story. There's a question in here for you, Bill, from Rick Brash over in the state of Washington. Want to know if you have any stories about Uncle Gene Brash. Is Uncle Gene Brash? Do you have any stories, or Smoke? It could apply to you too. Stories about Gene Brash.
Well, you don't have enough time for all the stories that I can tell you.
You got a quick one?
I agree.
I don't know if I really got a good story. I did spend a lot of time with him, and in the fall, of course, we actually used to go up the trail quite a lot together. So we had a lot of good times then. I do remember when we left Black Bear one day, it was 15 below, and I'm pretty damn certain that we're going to freeze to death before we get to Big Prairie. But Gene always had a bag full of stuff prepared for everything. And we did get pretty damn cold, but every time it got too cold, we'd stop and he'd pull out one of them fusees that the Forest Service uses to start fires with, stick that on a rock. We warm up our fingers and toes a little bit. We actually made it. And why he didn't freeze his toes, I don't know, because he actually used to run around with socks with no toes in them. And then he'd have two different kinds of boots on. One might be a little warmer than the other one. But yeah, a lot of really good times with Gene. I do know one more thing. When I first started, I was a lot younger, of course. I wasn't as experienced probably at drinking as Gene was at that time. Gene quit finally, but I did learn, sometime in the early 80s, I guess, that I can't start at 2 p.m. and drink past 10 o'clock at night. 10 was the end of it for me.
That's good advice for everybody.
But he told me he could roll home from where we were at. So I left him. So no, a lot of good times with Gene. So.
That's great. John,
Yeah, I remember old Gene.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I remember Gene real well too. I don't know whether you remember it, Bill, but remember when they come out with these radio dog collars, where you could find that, you could find a dog with the radio. Well, Gene brought those in and put them on his mules so that he could find them in the morning. He'd turn them out from Big Prairie and turn them loose. They'd head down towards Young Creek, and he'd get on his horse and go out there and tune them in, see if he could find them with the dog collars on them.
That's great. So
I got one more.
John, there's a question for you here. What would be your favorite piece of advice to give to writers, John?
To writers. Well, I always say read Stephen King's On Writing. It's his only nonfiction book. I'm not a fan of Stephen King's novels because they scare me too much. In his book On Writing, he describes his process for writing. Wildly successful writer. And it's, writing something every day is his secret. No matter what, you set a goal of 1,000 words, or like I'm working on my next book right now, and I've been doing this, 1,000 words or 2 pages or whatever, and set a goal and make sure you do it every day. That was just one of the things he talked about. And so that I would really highly recommend that on writing. And then, look at these guys. How can you go wrong if you find folks like this to bring your stories alive? I mean, you need to look for great subjects too. And Bill, if I could real quickly, I'd like to add in that one of the heroes in the book, Pat McVeigh, died May 18th of this year, and his chapter is called Pat McVeigh's Bob Marshall Secret. And his secret was, and I'm not a drinker, by the way, but it sounds like Bill is here. Pat McVeigh's secret to a long life was 1 shot of whiskey per day and 2 long summer trips in the Bob per year. And this trip that's highlighted in the book, there was 5 of them on the trip. And they all lived 3 of them lived into their late 80s or 90s. 2 of them lived to be over 100 on this one particular trip they've lived. So I think his secret's pretty good. And he has one story in here that's just really funny. First of all, they go over Larch Hill Pass and drop into the White River at Brushy Park. And you guys know the Chinese wall is kind of like a lightning rod. There's so much, it just seems like it's a very unstable place. And he had sparks going between the ears of his horses. Have you ever seen anything like that, Smoke?
I have never but I've seen them sparks on the trail, and of course that mostly comes from their shoes hitting rocks.
Yeah,
but that's what I've seen.
They came over and they got down into White River Park, and then they set up their camp. There's 5 of them, and along the lines of of his secret, here's what Pat says. And Pat just passed about 3 months ago. I'm so glad we could get this in here. He said, "We were sitting there having a tiddly, and we looked out and saw this old doe mule deer wander into camp," said Pat. Now, just previous to this, he had just caught 12 cutthroat, cleaned them, and put them in a dish pan and set them up on the pack boxes. So there's a really neat thing about how he caught the fish, and it's just this beautiful setting after the clearing, after the storm. So we were sitting there having a tiddly, and we looked out and saw this old mule deer wander to camp, said Pat. The campers enjoyed watching this beautiful animal calmly walk around camp, but they weren't too happy about what the doe did next. She wandered around a little bit, walked over and looked at the packs, and then she came back to the dish pan. I couldn't believe it. I said, "Hey, Gene, she's eating our fish." So 5 of us watched her eat every damn one of those cutthroat out of that pan. Pat said the piscivorous mule deer would eat a trout, look over at them, and then eat another one. We were kind of stunned, said Pat. We just sat there and thought about it for a while, but I'd never seen anything like that before. None of us had. So I thought that was a pretty unusual thing. And the thing about Pat, and consistent with preserving stories, this 100-year-old gentleman was an incredible person. And here's what he said at the end of his chapter. The friends would share many more trips and miles as the years marched on. It's hard to argue about Pat's theory that these trips and the shots of whiskey the travelers enjoyed each evening lengthened their lives. Pat and Milet became centenarians, and Milet's still alive. Looking back over a half-century of trips into the backcountry, Pat said, "Gosh, I wish I could do it all again. It's all so real in there. Everything that happens is unplanned. Nothing in this world is better for the spirit. I never wrote anything down. I just kept it in my heart." Wow. So this chapter is my ode to Pat because we got it written down. And it just reminds me so much of the purpose of the book. So just wanted to throw that in there.
That's great, John. We have another question here, and I think both Smoke and Bill should take turns answering this. And Bill, maybe we'll start with this, and I'll editorialize to say this is from one of my favorite young packers. The question is, what advice would you give to young packers just starting out? And Bill, we'll start with you.
Well, I would say be willing to learn, and after you learn a little bit, be willing to learn some more. There is a lot of people out there you can learn some from. Some you have to pick up on your own. But I just probably say keep an open mind. Yeah.
All right, Smoke, what's your answer to that question to a young packer starting out?
Yeah, I would say that, most packers, we all tie our knots separately. We all have our own way of tying knots and doing things. And you don't have to do it that way, but as long as you end up with the same result, that's the important thing. And I would suggest that he gets a good horse and a good mule, and that's a good way to start in packing. Make sure you get good ones. Don't buy these 2 and 3 year old young horses that you think, boy, these are going to be great, but it takes them 10 years to get great, and a lot of wet saddle blankets.
Now you tell me.
Kind of like Curly and Miller the mules, huh, Bill?
No, there was a time we used to think that was fun, but I think Smoke's got a point there too. You're a lot nicer with them other ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, you are.
One
So,
other thing to throw in, is that Bill has some great stories about mules versus horses. And I really learned a lot listening to you and Joe Murphy's family. And yeah, I remember your one story was, people that like to ride mules, I think it was your uncle that said, well, they say their mule can do this and do that, but at the end of the day, you're still riding a mule, and there seems to be like a stigma on it. And I was talking to Janie about it, Janie Moore, and the only time Janie Murphy, the only time Joe really sat her down and talked to her, because she cooked for Joe way back when, was about mules. And he sat her down. He said, Janie, I noticed you've been riding a mule. Can't have that, Janie. You can't be riding the outfit chief's daughter can't be riding a mule, Dan. Janie, you got to start riding a horse again. It was the only time that he ever told her anything. And I mean, you guys have hundreds of stories about mules versus horses, and there's quite a bit of it in the book.
somewhere Frank Vitale's cussing you under his breath for bringing this up, John, because Frank loves to ride his mule. So,
Well, he and Joe Murphy would have argued about that.
Another question for you, John, from John Edge. So John loved all those stories. Would like to know, in your words, what does the Bob Marshall Wilderness mean to you, and what inspired you to write the book?
Okay, well, sort of my soul was in the last chapter, where my best friend in college, we were both, Bill and I are very similar in age. I think I'm a couple years older, but in undergrad, we were both students, and he and I went on an elk hunt up in Pyramid Country in 1973. So it's 47 years ago now. And he ended up getting a nice bull, and we packed it out, and then some on the horses the next day. Dr. Bob Ream and Kathy Ream helped us pack them out. And Smoke would know that from the University of Montana. But then Terry, about 10 minutes later, was dead. He crashed in what is now the Welcome Mountain Wilderness while he was flying for Dr. Ream. And it's haunted me my entire life. I have had a whole life in the wilderness, and he only got a few short years before he was killed. And there's a lot of things about, and I mentioned you, Bill, I want to talk about the spiritual part if we get to it later, but I think there's a lot of spirits in the Bob Marshall, because when you look at people that have been there for a long time, Bill, you've been in there for 40 some years. You've left a lot of your DNA in there. You've left a lot of your elements from your body in there, like you have too, Smoke. So if we leave those physical things in there, why is it so hard to believe that we wouldn't leave part of our spirit in there too? And that's what I kind of explore in the last chapter. And then that goes into my next book. But that, I guess that's how I could explain it. And then also, people like George Ostrom, who jumped in the Bob, smoke jumpers, Bob Cooney, who had the first studies of grizzlies in the Bob. We found his last journals and brought that out. And then Bud Moore, the great conservationist. It was just such an honor to highlight all of them in this book, as well as Smoke and Bill and so many others. So just bringing those people to the forefront. And I don't know, most people probably think I'm crazy about the spiritualism part, but I could go on, and I bet all of us have had some sort of supernatural experience in the Bob where we just couldn't quite explain what happened. It happened to me with Terry McCoy, and I won't go into it, but you have to read the last chapter. So that's kind of how I'd answer it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I made my Schaefer this year, being relatively new here in Northwest Montana, and to sit there in the mess hall there at Schaefer it's hard not to hear 1,000 conversations pouring out of the walls. Decades and decades and decades of so many different people. I don't know if you call that spiritual, but it was impossible for me to sit there at that table and not hear the thousands of conversations that have gone on in that room. So
Yeah.
I think it's pretty powerful.
When you told me that, that really set with me, because there's a saw back there that has all the different Rangers at Schaefer carved into it, crosscut. And I knew them all, worked with them so much. I've met Bill in there when his wife was pregnant with his daughter. And how old's your daughter now?
31, I think.
There you go. And Schaefer's an amazing place. I always am drawn back there. I went in there once this year as well. But yeah, so when you said that, it really spoke to me that not just out there in the wilds of the Bob, but all those voices that were in there. Where did they go? Or there's some still there, and think of the hundreds and hundreds of employees and guests that have been in Schaefer Meadows. And you've spent how many nights at Schaefer Meadows, Bill?
Well, I haven't been there for a long time, but I think I've probably spent around 300 nights at Schaefer.
Okay. Well, you're still in there then.
I'm only 299 visits behind you, Bill. So one of my highlights from going into Schaefer with Guy Zollner and Chris Prue, and Smoke, this is to tee you up. As we rode in Morrison Creek, we looked for and found evidence of the road, which is an important story about how we ended up with the Great Bear. Would you talk about why there's a road as we ride in Morrison Creek and what you found and what led to the Great Bear?
Yeah, there's several reasons. Of course, the part of the road was put in there to help build the airfield at Schaefer. But the story that I'd like to tell a little bit about is that I traveled. I had a party that came out of Holland Lake, and we were going through to Spotted Bear, and we wanted to stay at the KBRL Rhoda Cook's ranch at Spotted Bear. So we stayed there a couple of days, and I had another party that wanted to go in on a short fishing trip. They wanted to go for 4 days. Well, I'll tell you, you can't hardly get anywhere in the Bob Marshall in 4 days and do any fishing. So anyway, we worked about it, talked about it a lot, and finally I said, why don't you have somebody fly you in the Schaefer, and I'll meet you there with the camp and your equipment, and you can fish a day or two, and then we'll go out over Morrison, up Lodgepole and over Morrison Creek, and come out at Chatter's cabin. And they said, hey, that'll work. Tom Collins organized a party of 6 people, 6 men. They were all businessmen from Missoula, lawyers. One of them was a publisher of the Missoulian. And anyway, these people were all pretty important people. Anyway, they brought all their gear up to my place about 2 days before the trip. And we piled it up and we managed it up. I had a young man by the name of Dave who had just hired because his father wanted him to get some experience to be a man. So he thought, well, send him with Smoke for a week or two, and we'll see if he can get broke into the backcountry. So anyway, Dave was there, and he didn't know how to manny or anything. So we managed everything up finally and got everything ready to go. And day before we were supposed to meet them at Schaefer. My wife brought all the gear up to the KBRL. Well, we loaded everything on the mules, and actually we went up big creek, one of the creeks there that went up to a trailhead to where you can get in there. Forget the name of that. Anyway,
Big Bill, probably.
we went up there with the we went up the road, a rough road, by the way, steep, hard to drive. I pulled a horse trailer, and I had a stock truck with my stock in it, and we only had we had five pack animals and 2 saddle horses, so I had the stock park was full, and Dave was driving the pickup with our managed gear in it. And anyway, we got around to the trailhead and loaded up the day we were supposed to meet them. We loaded up real early in the morning. I wanted to get an early start so that we get into Schaefer and find a campsite and then meet our guests. So anyway, this was early. This was in June, just before the 4th of July. Boy, there was snow in quite a few places yet. And I could see snow around on the hillsides. But at any rate, we packed up and headed around and went by Gunsight Mountain there. And by golly, when we got around on the north side of that pass, geez, snow was full there. I mean, it was white from the top all the way to the bottom, and I couldn't even see where the trail was. And then we led our horses up to the trail. No way we could get across. I tried to start with my horse, and gee, he sunk into his belly right away. No way. So at any rate, we untied everything, tied them all up there on the trail, and I scouted up around the head end of this snowslide. Finally found a way that I thought I could get them through. So I led my horse through, tied him up on the other side of this big snowslide, and then led each one of the pack animals. And of course, I had Diamond and Sorghum. They were a couple of my pack horses, and anyway, we got up on the side hill with Diamond, and he slipped for some reason or other, and down the hill he went. Packs all flew off. He slid about 100 yards down the hill in the snow. So I had to get down and pull him out of there and try to pull the packs over to the edge of the snow where we could probably load them. Dave brought another one of the horses, Sorghum, around, and Sorghum managed to jump through most of it. He got through. So we were starting to break a little trail through the snow. But anyway, we did all that and finally got through. And we got all the pack horses through and got Dave's horse through and started again towards the middle fork of the Flathead. We were going to go down Minor Creek. Anyway, we came around and of course the trail, we cut a few logs on the way, and finally we got down and we came to a little lake called Scott Lake. We went by Scott Lake. By the way, there are two moose standing out in the middle of that lake. There's always a moose in that lake. I've never been there when there wasn't a moose. But anyway, we went on down over the hill towards the middle fork. About then, I could hear a roar down below, and I thought, what the heck is that? Anyway, we got down there pretty close to the middle fork, and gee, here it is, running full tilt. And I mean, logs were rolling down the river, and it was deep and black. I mean, chocolate brown and then some. So I thought, well, Dave, I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we can get across. And I'm not sure we can get back over that snowslide to get back to our truck anyway. So I said, listen, I'll take two of the horses, Diamond and Sorghum, and I'll try to get across. And if I get across, then I'll signal you and you can come across. Of course, you couldn't talk because the roar was too loud. Anyway, I took my horse Cannonball and Diamond and Sorghum and started across the river. And of course, first thing is fill my boots, and then it filled the saddle with water, of course, and then all the way up to above my belt and sitting on the horse. And of course, I could feel the horse wasn't quite swimming, but you know, their hind legs hit the bottom of the river, and then they make kind of a jump ahead. And he did that about 15 or 20 times, and finally a little bit better, shallower water. And finally I got out on the other side. Anyway, I signaled Dave and I said, well, come on across. I signaled him with my hat. I just waved it around there. And so he started into the river. His horse was just a little shorter than mine, so he got wet all the way up to his shoulders. And he was really wet. But the worst thing about it is, as he was coming across the river, about not quite in the middle, but he was closer to me, fortunately, than he was the middle of the river. But his horse was also hitting the bottom of the river and jumping ahead, lunging ahead, not quite swimming. But at any rate, all of a sudden, Dave threw his reins up in the air, dropped the rope on the leading the horses across, and started to go into a fit. And I didn't realize he had epilepsy. He didn't tell me that. And of course, all the excitement, he never took his pills. So he went into an epileptic fit. So I turned Cannonball around and we went back out into the river. Finally got over to where Dave's horse, Babe, was standing, up to her belly, above her belly in the water, grabbed a hold of the reins and started to bring her to shore. And of course, the horses followed right away with them. The only thing is, I found that the rope was wrapped around Sorghum's leg pretty bad. But at any rate, we got out, and that kind of surprised me. But Dave had a heck of a time here. Anyway, we rested her for a while, and finally Dave said, "I'm okay now. I've got my pills." And so we packed them, tightened all the loads up. They were all crooked and everything else and wet. They were running water out the bottom. And anyway, we went on up towards Schaefer. We went when we came into the Schaefer airfield. We got there at about 6 o'clock. In those days in June, hell, it's daylight until almost 10. Anyway, we got to Schaefer and rode over to the ranger and talked to him. And I said, we're here to pick up six guests that we're gonna take them fishing for a couple of days, and then they're gonna fly out. And he said, okay, they're here, but they've already made arrangements to fly out. They didn't think you could make it over the snow, because when they flew in, they saw all that snow. Well, anyway, I said, well, where can we camp? And he said, they're still down the river fishing. And he said, they're going to meet the airplane here at about 8 o'clock. And I said, okay, where can we camp? And he said, well, go down the river ways, just a little ways beyond the end of the airfield. There's a trail that turns off towards the river there. The horses always go down there to graze. Anyway, we went down there, and there was a little grove of trees there. And we dropped all our loads and started setting up camp. And we got everything unmanned and got a couple of the tents up and the fly up for the kitchen and set up the stove. And Dave was out cutting wood, and we turned out the horses already, put a bell on some of them and turned them loose. And I picketed Cannonball. Anyway, as I opened up the loads, I found that one load had 2 cases of Highlander beer. I thought, boy, that's pretty nice. So anyway, I took 2 of those 6-packs. I took them down to the river. There was a little trail that went through the trees just a little ways, probably 60 feet, and found a trail to drop down to the river where I could get water anyway for supper. And anyway, I put the beer in there and put rocks around it. I thought, well, if they come down here, my golly, we might find them, and they might find us. Anyway, we continued to build. I built the fire, and we got supper going and cooking, and Dave finished taking care of all the horses and covering the saddles all up with canvas and everything. And then, by golly, pretty soon I heard some splashing down there in the river. And Tom Collins was leading the party, and he said, hey, you guys, somebody left some beer here in the creek. They won't care if we have a beer, will they? Anyway, those guys popped open some beer. And those were the kind, you had to use a can opener to open them, that kind of beer. Cans, they were steel cans then too. But at any rate, they were standing down there drinking beer, and I walked through the trees and I said, hey, camp's up here. Those guys couldn't believe it. Anyway, they walked up to camp. We had camp, and they got 2 days of fishing. And the next day, the last day, while we were going to go out to Route 2, I was going to meet my wife there. She had another party I was going to bring back in to Scott Lake in particular and Flotilla and do some fishing on the Middle Fork. So at any rate, when we started out, we packed up and headed up Lodgepole and started up into the trailhead there. And as we were getting up towards Challenge Cabin, we were going along and everything was going pretty good. The trail was a little muddy, and it always is, especially that trail going out towards Challenge Cabin, muddier than heck. And anyway, we were wading in there up to our knees, and all of a sudden, the guy said, hey, what's that? We could hear a motor running. I said, geez, we're still probably 3 miles or 2 miles at least from Challenge Cabin. And I said, geez, what's that? Anyway, we rode a little ways further, and here's a bulldozer pushing a road to extend the trailhead from Challenge Cabin on up the hill there, so they could go down, make it easier and shorter to run down to Schaefer. And he was pushing logs and rocks and everything else ahead of him. And geez, all of a sudden we were caught. We couldn't even get around him because he had logs pushed out on the side and stumps and everything else that we couldn't get around. So finally I got a hold of him and signaled him, and he shut her off, and he come over and he said, well, I can help you some. And he had an axe on the cat, and I had, of course, axe on the pack string, and we cut our way around this bulldozer. And my guests, they all looked at that and they said, I can't believe they're putting a road in here. They're coming in. Geez. Anyway, we managed to cut our way around the bulldozer and get back onto the trail. Actually, it was a road then. He had already cut out a road all the way down to Challenge Cabin. And when we got down to Challenge Cabin, there was my wife sitting there with a car, and loaded up our guests, and they started out for Missoula. Well, the one guy who was publisher of the Missoulian, he said, I want to stop at the first pay telephone. And by the way, that is number one phone, and that's on Route 2, going towards Kalispell. Anyway, she drove to that first phone, and she called up. Called up the Missoulian, and he said, hey, I want Dale Burke to come up here and report on this road that's going in to the middle fork of the Flathead. And he said, I want him to see what's going on. Anyway, that was kind of the beginning. Actually, they had started about a year or two earlier to develop the Great Bear wilderness. And anyway, Dale reported on it, and that started the Great Bear. And in 1972, it was made a wilderness, added to the Bob Marshall.
And that was the first riders of the University of Montana group that you took out, and that you would bring notable people to help support the wilderness, and Dale would help present it and that kind of thing. That was in the 60s, and look at the recall this guy has. That happened in the 60s. What an incredible story. Bill, could we get Workman to tell one more short story?
Yeah.
Bill, since we don't have much time, maybe you could just tell the one about the fire extinguisher that you were packing.
Well, it was one of them long, hot days coming from Big Prairie, 20-some miles. And all I'm looking forward to is getting in that cabin, drinking my Tang. I only got about 5 minutes left. And then we're going across the flat before we drop down to the bridge. It's all the further I got left to go. Little bear out there about 40 or 50 yards off the trail digging in the dirt, and wasn't causing any trouble. My horse saw him. I thought all my mules saw him. We were going by him, and all of a sudden old Zach must have been sleeping, I guess. He throwed his old head up and stopped, looks at that bear. Well, I'm still going, so he got yanked a little bit, so he started not really trotting, but kind of hitting the ground kind of hard. Why it didn't happen all day long, I don't know. But when he started hitting that ground hard, my ropes, sling rope going across my pack, started hitting on the handle of a fire extinguisher. So all of a sudden, the fire extinguisher started going shh, 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 every time he hit the ground. Well, that really made him blow up. So he went to jumping and kicking and scaring my string and every dang thing, of course, stampeding up around me. And I want to get off the trail and curl him up a little bit, but I really can't because there's a blowdown's really bad on one side, got the phone line on the other. So basically I just get things slowed down, and he's bucking, coming down the trail at me, and a pack comes up off him a little bit. Every time it hits on his side, it come down, a big old cloud of white stuff comes shooting out of that pack. And of course it shooshs some more, and he does it again. There's nothing really I could do until he finally throwed that damn thing off, and he had broke a pigtail. But anyways, it was kind of fun. At the same time, it was not funny because I wanted to be done, but here he was going to buck that pack off with that fire extinguisher going off in it. Fire extinguisher was supposed to be empty, which is why I was taking it out. The kids had their Olympics or something up there at Big Prairie one night, and they were playing soccer with a roll of toilet paper soaked in diesel and lit on fire. One of them caught on fire, so they had to use a fire extinguisher. So I got to bring it out. Anyhow, yeah, long story short, old Zach, every time he went up there and hit the ground, old white smoke would roll out of that pack, and of course he'd set it off again. And so it took me quite a bit longer to get down there to my dang Tang. So I was happy.
That's got to be unique.
Well, I call it my Charlie Russell moment, because even when I was trying to stop the whole damn bunch and look back and watching him, it was funny. I think he would have loved to paint that thing if he'd have saw it. So I painted it if I could paint.
Thanks, Bill.
John, do you have any final thoughts?
Well, I just very honored by the cooperation, being able to cooperate with the foundation. And hopefully we're going to use the book also as a fundraiser where some of the proceeds will go to it. And I know you guys are selling a lot of them. We're going to try to get some good support for the foundation for that. And I just, as you can see, I mean, how can you go wrong with these wonderful people? I mean, Smoke, you can just see that story come alive. He's told it almost exactly the same as in the book. And that was 50 years ago or more. And it's just amazing. We have these two heroes that are so incredibly, their memories are so short, and we're so lucky, and there's many more of them. So I'd encourage everybody to buy a book through the foundation and to read about these wonderful stories.
So here's the book. You can find it on our website. Bill Workman from Eureka, thank you for joining us tonight very much. Smoke from up the Rattlesnake down in Missoula, thank you for joining us tonight. And John, thank you for a wonderful book. I felt kind of bad that I showed up for a meeting with a bunch of hats and I didn't have my own hat on. So this is our new Love the Bob toboggan. It will be available for sale on our website here very shortly. But I didn't want to be the only guy to not finish this without a hat on. So
Great, Bill.
there's my hat. But thank you for a wonderful book. For thinking of the foundation and the book as a way to help support our work. I want to thank all the folks who joined us tonight for this evening. A reminder that, again, next Thursday night, we'll have Tim Manley from Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, Bryce Andrews from People and Carnivores, and we'll be talking about bears of the Bob. Remember, the auction is now live. You can get there through our website, bmwf.org. Up there at the top of the website, you'll see Happening Now, Voices of the Wilderness. And if you click there, it'll take you both to the auction and to the raffle as well. And again, we always appreciate everybody's support through your donations online. You can give through the website. If you don't want to go through the auction process, we just surely appreciate the support. But gentlemen, thank you for a great night. This has been a great way to kick off Voices of the Wilderness at home. So,
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill.
thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye-bye.